Sarah Martinez walked through the bustling military training facility cafeteria, her worn combat boots making soft sounds against the polished floor. The dining hall buzzed with conversations from hundreds of trainees, the clatter of metal trays and the occasional bark of laughter. She kept her head down, focusing on the simple task of getting her meal and finding a quiet corner to eat alone. At 28, Sarah appeared unremarkable among the sea of military personnel. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform looked standard issue. She moved with purpose but without the swagger that many trainees adopted to project confidence. To most observers, she seemed like just another recruit trying to make it through the rigorous training program. The facility housed various military training programs, bringing together personnel from different branches and specializations. Most trainees were young, fresh-faced recruits eager to prove themselves. They formed cliques quickly, bonding over shared struggles and common goals. Sarah, however, remained on the periphery of these social circles. She had arrived at the facility 3 weeks ago, assigned to what appeared to be a standard combat training rotation. Her paperwork listed her as a recent transfer, but the details were vague. Unlike other trainees who eagerly shared stories about their backgrounds and aspirations, Sarah kept her personal history private. When others talked about their previous assignments or training experiences, she simply listened politely and offered little in return. The other trainees had begun to notice her reserved nature. Some interpreted her quiet demeanor as arrogance, while others saw it as weakness. She rarely participated in the informal competitions that erupted during downtime, never boasted about her performance during exercises, and avoided the evening gatherings where trainees shared war stories and built camaraderie. During training exercises, Sarah's performance was competent but not flashy. She completed obstacle courses within acceptable time limits, scored adequately on marksmanship tests, and followed orders without complaint. Her instructors noted her consistent performance, but nothing that would make her stand out from the crowd. She seemed to deliberately avoid drawing attention to herself. What none of her fellow trainees knew was that Sarah's quiet confidence came from years of experience in one of the military's most elite units. Her real assignment at the facility was classified, part of an evaluation program that tested how special operations personnel integrated with conventional forces. The program was designed to assess whether elite soldiers could effectively operate alongside regular troops without revealing their specialized training. Sarah had spent the previous 6 years as a Navy SEAL, one of only a handful of women to successfully complete the grueling training program and serve in active operations. She had participated in classified missions across 3 continents, earned multiple commendations for valor, and developed skills that far exceeded anything taught in standard military training. Her superiors had selected her for this assignment, specifically because of her ability to blend in and assess situations without drawing attention. The dining hall represented a daily challenge for Sarah. Surrounded by trainees who were learning skills she had mastered years ago, she had to constantly modulate her responses and reactions. When others struggled with concepts she understood intuitively, she had to resist the urge to offer assistance that might reveal her background. When conversations turned to topics where her experience could provide valuable insights, she remained silent. She observed the social dynamics among the trainees with the analytical mind of someone trained in psychological operations. She noted which individuals emerged as natural leaders, which ones struggled with the pressure, and how different personalities clashed or complemented each other. All of this information would eventually be included in her confidential reports to her commanding officers. The facility's training program was designed to be challenging, pushing recruits to their physical and mental limits. Sarah watched as some trainees thrived under the pressure while others began to crack. She saw promising soldiers make critical errors due to stress, and witnessed others discover reserves of strength they never knew they possessed. Her unique perspective allowed her to understand both the effectiveness and limitations of the training methods being employed. Among the trainees, 7 individuals had formed a particularly tight-knit group. They were all male, ranging in age from 19 to 24, and came from similar backgrounds in terms of their military aspirations. They had bonded over their shared determination to excel in the program and their mutual support of each other. During difficult training phases, this group had begun to notice Sarah's solitary nature and misinterpreted it as standoffish behavior. They whispered among themselves about her attitude, creating narratives about why she seemed to think she was better than everyone else. Their conversations about her became increasingly negative, fueled by the stress of training and the natural tendency to find scapegoats for their frustrations. The group's leader was Marcus Thompson, a 23-year-old from Texas who had joined the military straight out of college. He was physically imposing, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with the build of someone who had played football in high school and college. Marcus had natural leadership qualities that drew others to him, but he also had a tendency toward aggression when he felt challenged or disrespected. Sarah was aware of the group's growing hostility toward her, but she chose not to address it directly. Her training had taught her to assess threats carefully and respond proportionally. She recognized that confronting the group prematurely could escalate tensions unnecessarily and potentially compromise her mission at the facility. As she moved through the dinner line that evening, Sarah could feel eyes watching her. The sensation was familiar from her operational experience, where situational awareness often meant the difference between mission success and failure. She noted the positions of the 7 trainees without appearing to look directly at them, cataloging their body language and energy levels. The dining hall was more crowded than usual, filled with the sounds of conversation and the typical noise of a military mess. Sarah selected her meal carefully, choosing foods that would provide sustained energy for the evening training exercises that lay ahead. She paid for her meal and began scanning the room for an available seat, preferably one that would allow her to observe the room while eating. What she did not realize was that Marcus and his group had been planning their approach for several days, waiting for the right moment to confront what they perceived as her arrogant attitude. They had chosen this evening specifically because the dining hall would be crowded, providing them with an audience for what they intended to be a public humiliation. Sarah found an empty table near the far wall of the dining hall, strategically positioned where she could observe the room while keeping her back protected. As she settled into her seat and began eating, she noticed the subtle shift in energy around Marcus Thompson's table. The 7 trainees were engaged in hushed conversation, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that had moved beyond casual curiosity into something more purposeful. Marcus leaned forward, speaking in low tones to his companions. "Look at her sitting there like she owns the place," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough for his group to hear. 3 weeks we've been here and she hasn't said more than 10 words to any of us. Acts like we're beneath her or something. Jake Morrison, a wiry 20-year-old from Michigan, nodded in agreement. "My buddy from Alpha Company says she barely participates in group discussions during tactical sessions. Just sits there with that know-it-all expression, like she's already figured everything out." Jake had been struggling with some of the more complex training modules and found Sarah's apparent confidence irritating. The third member of their group, Derek Williams, was a stocky former construction worker from Ohio who had joined the military seeking structure and purpose. "Maybe she thinks because she's older than most of us she doesn't need to prove herself," he suggested, stabbing at his food with unnecessary force. "Well, age doesn't automatically earn respect around here." Tony Chen, the smallest member of the group but arguably the most aggressive, had been watching Sarah with particular intensity. "I tried to be friendly with her last week during equipment maintenance," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Asked her about her previous assignment, just trying to make conversation. She looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language and just walked away." The remaining 3 members of the group, Brad, Kevin, and Alex, were newer to the facility, but had quickly been absorbed into Marcus's circle. They fed off the group's energy and were eager to prove their loyalty to the established hierarchy. Their youth and inexperience made them particularly susceptible to groupthink and the desire to belong. "Someone needs to humble her," Brad declared, his voice carrying the bravado of someone trying to impress his peers. At 19, he was the youngest member of the group and often felt pressure to prove his worth through aggressive posturing. "She needs to understand that we're all in this together, and her attitude isn't helping anyone." Marcus studied Sarah for a long moment, noting how she ate with mechanical efficiency while maintaining awareness of her surroundings. Something about her posture and movement patterns struck him as different from typical trainees, but he couldn't quite identify what it was. His frustration with her perceived arrogance overcame any instinct to investigate further. "Tonight," Marcus decided, his voice taking on the tone of authority that had made him the group's natural leader. "After she finishes eating, we approach her together. Nothing violent, Nothing that could get us in trouble with the instructors. Just a conversation about respect and teamwork. The plan was simple in its conception, but revealed the group's fundamental misunderstanding of both the situation and the person they were targeting. They saw Sarah's behavior through the lens of their own insecurities and limited experience, creating a narrative that justified their growing resentment. Sarah continued eating, acutely aware of the conversation happening across the dining hall. Her training in surveillance and intelligence gathering had sharpened her ability to read lips and interpret body language from a distance. She could see the group's agitation building and recognize the signs of an impending confrontation. In her previous operational experience, Sarah had learned to differentiate between genuine threats and posturing behavior. This group represented the latter, young men acting out of frustration and wounded pride rather than any real malicious intent. However, she also understood that such situations could escalate quickly if not handled properly. Her mind automatically began running through response scenarios. The confined space of the dining hall limited her options for de-escalation, and the presence of hundreds of other trainees meant that any confrontation would quickly become public. Her cover assignment required her to maintain a low profile, which meant she couldn't simply intimidate the group into backing down. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. During her SEAL training, she had faced challenges far more demanding than anything these trainees could imagine. She had endured Hell Week, completed underwater demolition exercises in conditions that would terrify experienced divers, and survived combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. Yet here she was, being targeted by a group of trainees who saw her as vulnerable. Sarah finished her meal and began preparing to leave, knowing that movement would likely trigger the group's approach. She mentally rehearsed various response strategies, considering how to handle the situation without revealing her true capabilities or compromising her mission. The goal was to diffuse the tension while maintaining her cover identity. As she stood and gathered her tray, Sarah noticed that other diners had begun to sense the building tension. Conversations at nearby tables had become more subdued, and several trainees were glancing between her table and Marcus's group with anticipation. The dining hall's atmosphere had shifted from casual to expectant. Marcus exchanged glances with his companions and gave a subtle nod. The 7 trainees rose from their table in unison, their movements coordinated like a military unit preparing for action. Other diners noticed the synchronized behavior and began paying closer attention to the unfolding drama. Sarah moved toward the tray return area, maintaining her normal pace despite the awareness that she was being followed. She could hear the group's footsteps behind her, their formation loose but purposeful. The sound of their boots on the dining hall floor seemed louder than usual in the increasingly quiet space. The moment of confrontation was approaching rapidly. Sarah reached the tray return area and set down her dishes, using the brief pause to assess her options one final time. The group was closing in, their body language becoming more aggressive with each step. She turned to face them, her expression neutral but alert. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the now nearly silent dining hall. "We need to have a word with you." The formal tone did little to mask the underlying hostility in his words. The other 6 trainees spread out slightly, creating a loose semicircle that effectively blocked Sarah's exit routes. Every eye in the dining hall was now focused on the confrontation. Conversations had stopped entirely, and even the kitchen staff had paused their activities to watch. The tension was palpable, and everyone present understood that they were about to witness something significant. Sarah turned slowly to face the 7 trainees, her movements deliberate and controlled. The dining hall had fallen completely silent, with hundreds of eyes focused on the unfolding confrontation. She studied each member of the group for a brief moment, noting their positioning, body language, and apparent level of commitment to whatever they had planned. "What can I do for you?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and even. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides, maintaining a non-threatening posture while positioning herself to react quickly if necessary. Years of tactical training had taught her the importance of appearing non-aggressive while remaining prepared for any possibility. Marcus stepped forward, clearly established as the group's spokesperson. His height advantage was obvious as he looked down at Sarah, and his broad shoulders were squared in a display of physical dominance. "We've been watching you for weeks," he began, his voice carrying across the silent dining hall. You walk around here like you're better than everyone else, like the rest of us aren't worth your time." The accusation hung in the air, and Sarah could feel the anticipation of the crowd around them. Some of the watching trainees were clearly hoping for drama, while others seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. She noticed several senior personnel at tables near the back of the dining hall, including a few instructors who were observing but not yet intervening. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah replied, maintaining her neutral tone. She genuinely didn't understand how her efforts to maintain a low profile had been interpreted as arrogance. Her SEAL training had emphasized the importance of blending in with local populations during operations, and she had applied those same principles here. Jake Morrison moved closer, emboldened by the public setting and the support of his group. "Don't play dumb with us," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think because you're older, because you've got some mysterious background that you don't have to interact with the rest of us like normal people?" Derek Williams nodded aggressively. "We're all here for the same reason, trying to serve our country and become better soldiers. But you act like you're already graduated from some elite program the rest of us could never understand." His words carried the frustration of someone who had been struggling with certain aspects of the training. Sarah realized that her careful behavior had created exactly the opposite impression she had intended. Her attempts to avoid drawing attention had instead made her seem aloof and superior. The irony was bitter. Her actual elite background was far beyond what these trainees imagined, but she had never intended to project that superiority. Tony Chen stepped forward aggressively, his smaller stature compensated by an excess of aggressive energy. "My cousin went through Ranger training and he says people like you are all the same. Think you're special operators before you've even earned it." His words revealed the group's underlying assumption about Sarah's background. The remaining 3 trainees, Brad, Kevin, and Alex, formed a tighter semicircle around Sarah. Their youth and inexperience showed in their obvious nervousness, but peer pressure and loyalty to the group kept them committed to the confrontation. They glanced between Marcus and Sarah, waiting for their leader's next move. "Look," Sarah said, trying to defuse the situation through reason. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just here to complete my training like everyone else. I haven't meant to offend anyone or seem unfriendly." She spoke loud enough for the watching crowd to hear, hoping that a public de-escalation might satisfy the group's need to save face. Marcus shook his head dismissively. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice getting louder. "Even now you're talking down to us like we're children who don't understand the situation. You think a few calm words are going to make us back down and forget how you've been treating everyone?" The crowd around them pressed closer, sensing that the confrontation was escalating. Some trainees had begun pulling out their phones to record the incident, while others looked around for instructors who might intervene. The dining hall staff had stopped all activity and were watching with mixture of concern and fascination. Sarah's tactical mind was racing through options. A simple apology might diffuse the immediate situation, but it could also be seen as weakness and encourage further harassment. Standing her ground risked escalation, but allowing herself to be publicly humiliated could undermine her mission and potentially affect other trainees' perceptions of her capabilities. "What exactly do you want from me?" Sarah asked, deciding to force the group to articulate their demands. In her operational experience, aggressors often lost momentum when required to specify their goals, rather than simply venting frustration. Derek stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. "We want you to admit that you're not better than the rest of us," he declared. "We want you to stop acting like you're too good to be part of the team and start showing some respect for your fellow trainees." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "And we want an apology," he added. "To everyone here who you've been ignoring and disrespecting with your attitude." The demand for a public apology revealed the group's desire to humiliate Sarah in front of the assembled crowd. Sarah felt a familiar calm settling over her, the same mental state she had experienced during high-stress operations. Her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled, and her mind clear. She was entering the psychological zone that had served her well during countless dangerous situations. "I understand you're frustrated," she said, her voice remaining steady despite the increasing hostility around her. "But I'm not going to apologize for something I haven't done. If my behavior has seemed unfriendly, that wasn't my intention. But I won't admit to arrogance or disrespect that I haven't shown." The refusal to back down sent a ripple of surprise through the watching crowd. Many had expected Sarah to capitulate under the pressure of the group confrontation. Her calm defiance seemed to catch even Marcus off guard, as he had clearly expected her to either apologize or become defensive. Tony Chen's face darkened with anger. "So that's how it's going to be?" he demanded. "You're going to stand there and pretend like you haven't been acting like you're better than everyone here?" His voice carried a threatening undertone that made several nearby trainees step back. The situation was reaching a critical point. Sarah could see that the group had invested too much in the confrontation to back down easily, and her refusal to apologize had escalated their frustration. She began mentally preparing for the possibility that words alone would not resolve the situation. Marcus took another step closer, his physical presence becoming more intimidating. "Maybe what you need is a lesson in humility," he said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that somehow carried across the silent dining hall. "Maybe you need to understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of disrespect." The threat in Marcus's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the familiar shift in her consciousness that occurred when a situation moved from verbal confrontation to potential physical conflict. Her years of training kicked in automatically, and she began assessing the tactical situation with the cold precision of a combat veteran. 7 opponents, all larger than her, positioned in a loose semicircle that blocked most exit routes. The nearest instructors were approximately 30 feet away, too far to intervene immediately if violence erupted. The crowd of watching trainees formed an additional obstacle, their presence limiting her movement options while also serving as witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. "Let me make something clear," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "You're going to apologize to everyone here for your attitude, and you're going to start acting like part of the team. Or we're going to help you understand how things work around here." Jake Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by Marcus's aggressive stance. "This is your last chance to do this the easy way," he added, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "We're trying to be reasonable here, but our patience isn't unlimited." Sarah's mind automatically began calculating distances, angles, and potential weapons. The metal trays stacked nearby could serve as improvised shields or striking implements. The spacing between her opponents revealed gaps that could be exploited for movement. Her training had taught her to identify every tactical advantage in any environment, no matter how unlikely the setting for combat might seem. Derek Williams moved to close one of the gaps in their formation, apparently recognizing that their positioning needed improvement. "You see how many of us there are?" he said, gesturing to his companions. "You really think you can stand against all of us? Just admit you were wrong, and this can all be over." The crowd around them had grown larger and more agitated. Some trainees were encouraging the confrontation, calling out suggestions and commentary. Others looked uncomfortable with the escalating situation but seemed unwilling or unable to intervene. The dining hall had become an arena, with Sarah as the unwilling focal point of hundreds of spectators. Tony Chen cracked his knuckles in an obvious display of intimidation. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for weeks," he declared. "Someone needs to teach you that respect goes both ways, and apparently that someone is going to be us." Sarah's tactical assessment was complete. The 7 trainees were confident in their numerical advantage and the public setting, but they had made several critical errors. They had positioned themselves too close together, limiting their ability to maneuver independently. Their formation blocked each other's angles of attack as much as it contained her. Most importantly, they had no idea what they were actually facing. "You're making a mistake," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that was lost on the aggressive trainees but noticed by some of the more experienced personnel watching from the crowd. "This doesn't have to go any further." Brad, the youngest member of the group, laughed nervously. "The only mistake here is thinking you can keep disrespecting people without consequences," he said, trying to match the aggressive energy of his companions. His inexperience showed in his obvious nervousness, but peer pressure kept him committed to the confrontation. Kevin and Alex flanked Sarah's remaining escape routes, completing the encirclement. They exchanged glances that revealed their uncertainty about what was actually supposed to happen next. It was clear that the group had planned the confrontation, but hadn't thought through the specifics of how it would end. Marcus raised his voice so the entire dining hall could hear. "Last chance, Martinez. Apologize for your attitude and commit to being part of the team, or we'll help you understand how things work around here. The ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. Sarah's response surprised everyone in the dining hall. Instead of backing down or becoming defensive, she smiled slightly, a calm expression that seemed completely out of place given the threatening situation surrounding her. The smile reached her eyes, reflecting a confidence that the 7 trainees couldn't understand. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining calm despite being surrounded by hostile opponents. The question wasn't directed at any specific member of the group, but seemed to encompass all of them. Jake Morrison misinterpreted her response as additional arrogance. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with," he said aggressively. "Some trainee who thinks she's hot stuff because she's got a few years on the rest of us." "Well, age doesn't make you tough." Sarah's smile widened slightly. In all her years of SEAL training and operations, she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. She had faced enemy combatants, survived dangerous reconnaissance missions, and completed operations that pushed the limits of human endurance. But she had never been cornered by a group of trainees who had no idea they were threatening one of the most elite soldiers in the military. Derek Williams stepped forward aggressively. "Wipe that smirk off your face," he demanded. "You think this is funny? You think 7 against 1 is some kind of joke?" His frustration was evident in his voice and body language. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Sarah had spent weeks carefully concealing her true capabilities, maintaining a low profile to complete her classified assignment. Now that very restraint had led to a confrontation where revealing her identity seemed inevitable. Tony Chen moved closer, his aggressive posture becoming more pronounced. "You've got about 10 seconds to start showing some respect," he warned. "After that, we're going to teach you a lesson you won't forget." Sarah's training had prepared her for countless scenarios, but the protocols for handling situations like this were unclear. Her mission required maintaining her cover, but she also had a responsibility to protect herself and potentially prevent a situation that could result in serious injuries to the trainees threatening her. The watching crowd sensed that the confrontation was reaching its climax. Conversations had stopped entirely, and the dining hall was filled with anticipatory tension. Even the instructors who had been observing from a distance began moving closer, apparently recognizing that intervention might soon be necessary. Marcus made the decision for everyone. "Time's up," he declared, and took a step towards Sarah with his hands raised in a threatening manner. "Let's see how tough you really are when you can't hide behind that attitude." Sarah's response was instantaneous and completely unexpected. Instead of backing away or assuming a defensive posture, she stepped forward to meet Marcus's advance. Her movement was fluid and confident, displaying a level of tactical awareness that immediately changed the dynamic of the confrontation. "Stop," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present before. For the first time since the confrontation began, her tone suggested that she was not the victim in this situation. "You need to walk away right now before this goes somewhere none of you want it to go." The sudden change in Sarah's demeanor sent a ripple of uncertainty through the 7 trainees. Marcus hesitated mid-step, his confidence wavering as he processed the unexpected authority in her voice. The woman who had seemed passive and vulnerable moments before now stood with a presence that suggested combat experience far beyond anything he had anticipated. Jake Morrison, however, misread the situation entirely. "Oh, now you want to act tough?" he sneered, stepping forward to support Marcus. "A little late for that, don't you think? You should have thought about consequences before you decided to disrespect everyone here." Sarah's eyes shifted to Jake, and for a brief moment he caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach tighten with unease. There was a coldness in her gaze that spoke of experiences beyond the training facility, beyond anything most soldiers ever encountered. But his pride and the pressure from his companions pushed him past the warning signs his instincts were providing. Derek Williams, emboldened by Jake's advance, moved closer from Sarah's left flank. "2 warnings and you still think you can intimidate us," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "Time to learn some humility the hard way." The crowd around them had grown silent with anticipation, sensing that the verbal confrontation was about to become physical. Some trainees near the back began moving toward the exits, while others pressed closer for a better view. The instructors who had been observing from a distance quickened their pace, but they were still too far away to intervene immediately. Tony Chen made the first aggressive move, reaching out to grab Sarah's shoulder in what he probably intended as an intimidating gesture. His hand never made contact. Sarah's response was so fast that most of the watching crowd missed the details of what happened. Tony found himself face down on the dining hall floor, his arm twisted behind his back in a control hold that sent sharp pain through his shoulder and elbow. The entire maneuver had taken less than 2 seconds. Sarah had redirected Tony's reaching motion, used his momentum against him, and applied a restraint technique that immobilized him completely without causing permanent injury. Her movements had been precise, economical, and executed with a level of skill that immediately changed everyone's understanding of the situation. "What the hell?" Brad exclaimed, staring in shock at Tony's prone form. The youngest member of the group had expected to see Sarah overwhelmed by superior numbers, not efficiently neutralizing their first attacker with movements too quick to follow. Marcus backed up a step, his tactical situation suddenly much more complex than he had anticipated. "Let him go," he demanded, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried moments before. The ease with which Sarah had handled Tony suggested that their numerical advantage might not be as decisive as they had assumed. Sarah maintained her grip on Tony's arm while addressing the remaining 6 trainees. "This is your opportunity to walk away," she said calmly. "Take your friend to the medical bay. Apologize for the misunderstanding, and we can all forget this happened." Kevin and Alex exchanged uncertain glances, clearly reconsidering their involvement in the confrontation. They had signed up to intimidate what they thought was an arrogant trainee, not to fight someone with obvious combat skills. The demonstration of Sarah's capabilities had shattered their assumptions about the situation. Jake Morrison, however, was too invested in the confrontation to back down. "Lucky shot," he declared, though his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "Let's see how you handle more than one of us at a time." He gestured to Derek and Marcus, encouraging them to coordinate their attack. Sarah's tactical mind was already 3 moves ahead of her opponents. She could see their positioning, predict their likely movements, and had identified the sequence of techniques that would neutralize each of them with minimal injury. Her SEAL training had prepared her for situations far more dangerous than this, against opponents far more skilled and ruthless. Derek Williams attempted to coordinate with Jake, approaching from Sarah's left while Jake moved from her right. Their attack was poorly synchronized and telegraphed, revealing their lack of experience in actual combat situations. Sarah released Tony's arm and stepped backward, creating space to maneuver while keeping all remaining opponents in her field of vision. The crowd around them gasped as Derek launched himself toward Sarah, apparently intending to tackle her while Jake grabbed her from the opposite side. Sarah's response demonstrated years of training in close-quarters combat. She stepped into Derek's charge, redirected his momentum, and used his own energy to send him tumbling into a nearby table with a crash that echoed through the dining hall. Jake's attempt to grab her from behind was countered with an elbow strike that connected with his solar plexus, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for breath. Sarah's movements were fluid and controlled, each technique precise enough to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. Marcus stared in disbelief as 3 of his companions found themselves disabled within seconds. Tony was still on the ground holding his shoulder. Derek was struggling to untangle himself from overturned chairs, and Jake was bent over trying to catch his breath. The confident group that had cornered Sarah minutes before was rapidly becoming a collection of confused and injured trainees. "This isn't possible," Brad whispered, his voice filled with shock and growing fear. "She's just a trainee like us. How is she doing this?" His worldview was crumbling as he watched someone he had assumed was vulnerable systematically defeat his more experienced companions. Kevin and Alex began backing away from the confrontation, their survival instincts overriding their loyalty to the group. They had witnessed enough to understand that continuing the fight would only result in their own humiliation and potential injury. Sarah turned her attention to Marcus, who remained the group's nominal leader despite the rapidly deteriorating situation. "You can stop this right now," she offered, her voice remaining calm despite having just neutralized 3 attackers. "Help your friends, get them medical attention if they need it, and walk away." Marcus looked around at his fallen companions, then at the crowd of spectators who were staring in amazement at the scene before them. His carefully planned confrontation had become a public demonstration of his group's incompetence against a single opponent they had dismissed as weak and arrogant. Pride and embarrassment warred with common sense in Marcus's mind. Everything he thought he knew about the situation had proven wrong, but admitting defeat in front of hundreds of spectators felt impossible. His military training told him to reassess and withdraw, but his ego demanded that he salvage something from the humiliating situation. "You got lucky," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Surprised us with some martial arts moves. But this isn't over." He helped Jake to his feet, while Derek slowly extracted himself from the overturned furniture. Mara watched the regrouping with the patient, attention of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents. "Yes, it is over," she replied firmly. "The only question now is whether you're smart enough to realize it." The instructors who had been moving toward the confrontation finally arrived at the scene, their presence adding a new dynamic to the situation. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran of multiple deployments, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes that immediately recognized the disparity in combat skills he had just witnessed. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order in chaotic situations. The arrival of official oversight changed the entire context of the confrontation, transforming it from a personal dispute into a potential disciplinary matter. Staff Sergeant Williams surveyed the chaotic scene before him with the practiced eye of a combat veteran. Tony Chen remained on the ground clutching his shoulder. Derek Williams was slowly untangling himself from overturned chairs and scattered meal trays, and Jake Morrison stood hunched over, still trying to catch his breath. The remaining 4 trainees stood in various states of shock and confusion, while Sarah Martinez maintained a calm, alert posture that immediately caught the instructor's attention. "I asked what's going on here," Staff Sergeant Williams repeated, his voice cutting through the murmur of the watching crowd. His presence had the immediate effect of dispersing some of the spectators, though many remained to witness the aftermath of the unprecedented confrontation. Marcus Thompson stepped forward, apparently deciding to speak for his group despite their obvious defeat. "There was a misunderstanding, Staff Sergeant," he began, his voice strained as he tried to maintain some dignity. "We were trying to address some team cohesion issues and things got out of hand." The instructor's experienced gaze moved between the injured trainees and Sarah's unmarked appearance. In his 15 years of military service, he had seen enough fights to immediately recognize the skill disparity that had produced this outcome. One person had systematically defeated multiple opponents without sustaining any visible damage, which suggested training far beyond what standard recruits possessed. "Team cohesion issues?" Staff Sergeant Williams repeated skeptically. "That resulted in 3 injured personnel and significant property damage?" He gestured toward the overturned tables and scattered equipment that marked the brief but decisive confrontation. Sarah stepped forward, recognizing that the situation required careful handling to avoid compromising her classified assignment. "Staff Sergeant, there was a disagreement that escalated beyond what anyone intended," she said diplomatically. "I attempted to de-escalate the situation, but when physical contact was initiated, I defended myself." The instructor studied Sarah more carefully, noting details that he had missed during his initial assessment. Her posture, the way she moved, and the calm confidence in her voice all suggested military experience that extended far beyond basic training. His instincts were telling him that there was much more to this trainee than her file indicated. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the facility's chief medical officer, arrived with 2 medical technicians in response to reports of injured personnel. Her assessment of the 3 affected trainees was swift and professional. Tony Chen had a dislocated shoulder that would require immediate attention. Derek Williams had multiple bruises and a possible concussion from his impact with the furniture. And Jake Morrison was suffering from bruised ribs and difficulty breathing. "These injuries are consistent with skilled combat techniques," Dr. Hayes observed quietly to Staff Sergeant Williams. "Whoever did this knew exactly how to disable multiple opponents efficiently without causing permanent damage. This wasn't a typical trainee altercation." The medical assessment added another layer of complexity to the situation. The precision and control evident in the injuries suggested that Sarah possessed combat skills far beyond what her training records indicated. Staff Sergeant Williams found himself confronting the possibility that one of his trainees had been concealing significant military experience. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison arrived as the medical team was treating the injured trainees. His presence immediately elevated the seriousness of the situation, as incidents involving multiple injuries typically required command-level investigation. He surveyed the scene with the analytical mind of someone responsible for maintaining order and discipline within the facility. "Report," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison ordered curtly, addressing Staff Sergeant Williams while his eyes continued to assess the aftermath of the confrontation. "Sir, we have a situation involving 7 trainees who apparently confronted Trainee Martinez regarding alleged attitude problems," Staff Sergeant Williams reported. The confrontation escalated to physical contact, resulting in 3 injuries. Martinez appears to have defended herself effectively against multiple attackers. The use of the word effectively was a significant understatement given the evidence before them. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison was experienced enough to recognize that a single person defeating 3 attackers without sustaining injury suggested either remarkable luck or exceptional training. His suspicious gaze fixed on Sarah with new interest. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Step forward." Sarah approached the commanding officer with the bearing of someone comfortable with military hierarchy. Her posture and movement immediately reinforced Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's growing suspicions about her background. Years of experience had taught him to recognize soldiers with elite training, and every indicator pointed toward Sarah being far more than she appeared. "Sir," Sarah responded crisply, standing at attention in a manner that demonstrated familiarity with military protocol. "Your training record indicates basic combat instruction and standard physical fitness preparation," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stated, consulting a tablet that contained her official file. "Yet you apparently defeated 3 larger opponents simultaneously. How do you explain this discrepancy?" The question put Sarah in a difficult position. Her classified assignment required maintaining her cover identity, but the evidence of her capabilities made continued deception increasingly problematic. She had to balance operational security with the immediate need to address a command-level investigation. "Sir, I have some previous martial arts training that isn't reflected in my current file," Sarah replied carefully. "When confronted by multiple attackers, I use the minimum force necessary to defend myself." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's expression suggested that he found her explanation inadequate. "Previous martial arts training sufficient to disable 3 military personnel without sustaining injury is not typically omitted from training records," he observed. "I'm beginning to suspect there's information about your background that hasn't been properly documented." The crowd of watching trainees had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread throughout the facility. Many were whispering among themselves, trying to understand how someone they had dismissed as unremarkable had demonstrated such exceptional combat skills. The incident was rapidly becoming the most significant event in the facility's recent history. Marcus Thompson, despite his group's humiliating defeat, decided to make one final attempt to salvage his position. "Sir, with respect, Martinez has been displaying an attitude of superiority since she arrived here," he interjected. "We were attempting to address what we saw as a team cohesion problem when she became violent." The accusation hung in the air, and Sarah realized that the situation had moved beyond simple conflict resolution. Her cover was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and the investigation was likely to reveal information that would compromise her classified assignment. Staff Sergeant Williams stepped forward, having made his own assessment of the situation. "Sir, based on my observation of the scene and the nature of the injuries, I believe Martinez demonstrated remarkable restraint," he reported. "The techniques used were precise and controlled, designed to neutralize threats without causing permanent damage. This suggests advanced training in non-lethal combat methods." Dr. Hayes approached with her medical assessment completed. "Lieutenant Colonel, the injuries are consistent with someone who knew exactly how to disable opponents efficiently," she reported. "The shoulder dislocation was applied with textbook precision, and the other injuries show similar technical expertise. This wasn't random fighting." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison processed the information from his staff while studying Sarah with increasing interest. Every piece of evidence pointed toward her possessing combat training, far beyond what her official records indicated. His next decision would determine whether her classified assignment could continue or if her cover had been irreparably compromised. "Martinez, I'm going to ask you one more time," he said firmly, Is there anything about your background, training, or current assignment that you haven't disclosed? Because the evidence suggests that you're not quite the standard trainee your file indicates. Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The truth would end her classified assignment, but might also prevent further complications. Continued deception was becoming untenable given the scrutiny she was receiving. Her decision would affect not only her mission, but potentially the safety and careers of everyone involved in the confrontation. Sarah looked directly at Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, weighing her options in the span of a few seconds. The classified nature of her assignment meant that revealing her true identity could have consequences far beyond this single incident. However, the investigation had reached a point where continued deception would likely create more problems than disclosure. "Sir, I need to speak with you privately," Sarah said, her voice carrying a tone of authority that surprised many of the watching trainees. "There are aspects of my assignment here that require classified discussion." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly at her response. The mention of classified assignments immediately changed the context of the entire situation. In his experience, trainees didn't typically have classified assignments, unless there were extraordinary circumstances involved. Staff Sergeant Williams, "Clear this area of all non-essential personnel," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison ordered. Dr. Hayes continued treating the injured, "But I want this dining hall secured for a private conversation." As the crowd of spectators reluctantly dispersed and the injured trainees were moved to the medical facility, Sarah found herself alone with the commanding officer and his senior staff. The dining hall, which had been filled with hundreds of people minutes before, now felt cavernous and quiet. "Before we continue," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison said, "I need to verify something." He pulled out a secure communication device and made a brief call to his superiors. After a few minutes of conversation filled with military terminology and security protocols, he ended the call and studied Sarah with a completely different expression. "Well, this explains quite a lot," he said, his tone now reflecting respect rather than suspicion. "I've just been informed that you're here on a classified evaluation assignment that I wasn't briefed on. Apparently your real background is significantly more impressive than your cover identity suggested." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern as her true status was acknowledged. "Yes, sir. I'm Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez, currently assigned to SEAL Team 7. I've been here for 3 weeks conducting an evaluation of integration protocols between special operations personnel and conventional forces." The revelation sent visible shock through Staff Sergeant Williams and Dr. Hayes. They had just witnessed a Navy SEAL defend herself against multiple attackers, which explained the extraordinary skill disparity they had observed. The precision and control she had demonstrated were the result of some of the most rigorous combat training in the military. "The trainees who confronted you had no idea who they were dealing with," Lieutenant Colonel Morrison observed. "They saw someone they perceived as aloof and decided to teach her a lesson in humility. Instead, they learned a lesson in why assumptions can be dangerous." Sarah nodded, reflecting on the irony of the situation. "Sir, my assignment required maintaining a low profile to accurately assess how elite personnel integrate with standard training programs. My efforts to avoid drawing attention apparently created the impression that I was arrogant or superior." Dr. Hayes stepped forward with a new understanding of what she had witnessed. "The restraint you showed was remarkable," she commented. "With your training, you could have seriously injured all 7 of them. Instead, you used minimal force to neutralize the threats without causing permanent damage. That's standard protocol for situations involving non-hostile personnel," Sarah explained. "The trainees were acting out of frustration and wounded pride, not genuine malicious intent. They didn't deserve to be seriously injured for a misunderstanding." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison turned his attention to the broader implications of the incident. "This confrontation has compromised your cover assignment," he noted. "Word of what happened here will spread throughout the facility within hours. Your ability to continue the evaluation without your identity affecting the results has been eliminated." Sarah had reached the same conclusion. "Yes, sir. I'll need to contact my commanding officer and report that the assignment has been compromised. We'll need to determine whether to abort the evaluation or modify the parameters to account for the changed circumstances." Staff Sergeant Williams, still processing the revelation that one of his trainees was actually an elite special operations soldier, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What happens to the 7 trainees who confronted you? They attacked a Navy SEAL based on completely incorrect assumptions. The question highlighted one of the more complex aspects of the situation. The trainees had acted on genuine grievances based on their limited understanding of the situation. Their behavior had been inappropriate, but it had also revealed important information about how elite personnel were perceived by conventional forces. That's part of what makes this incident valuable data for the evaluation, Sarah explained. The fact that my behavior was misinterpreted as arrogance suggests that integration protocols need improvement. The trainee's reaction provides insight into how special operations personnel might be received in mixed units. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison considered the various factors involved in determining appropriate consequences for the confrontation. The trainees will face disciplinary action for initiating an unauthorized confrontation that resulted in injuries, he decided. However, given the unusual circumstances and the fact that they were operating under false assumptions about your identity, the penalties will be educational rather than punitive. Dr. Hayes reported that the 3 injured trainees were receiving appropriate medical care and would recover fully within a few weeks. Tony Chen's dislocated shoulder would require the most extensive rehabilitation, but even he would return to full duty without permanent limitations. As word of Sarah's true identity spread through the facility, the reaction among the trainee population was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and grudging respect. Many who had interpreted her behavior as arrogance now understood that her restraint and professionalism had actually been signs of exceptional discipline and training. Marcus Thompson and his group faced a painful reckoning with their assumptions and behavior. They had targeted someone they perceived as weak and discovered that their victim was actually one of the most elite soldiers in the military. The humiliation was compounded by the realization that Sarah could have seriously injured all of them, but had chosen to use minimal force. The incident became a powerful teaching moment for the entire facility. Instructors used it to emphasize the importance of not making assumptions about others based on limited information. The confrontation demonstrated how quickly situations could escalate and how dangerous it could be to challenge people without understanding their true capabilities. Sarah's evaluation assignment was ultimately modified to focus on how the revelation of her identity affected her interactions with other trainees. The data collected before and after the incident provided valuable insights into the challenges of integrating elite and conventional personnel in mixed units. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison filed a comprehensive report on the incident that would influence future training protocols and integration procedures. The confrontation had inadvertently revealed important weaknesses in how special operations personnel were prepared for assignments with conventional forces. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her modified assignment with her true identity, known throughout the facility. The change in how she was treated by other trainees provided additional valuable data for her evaluation. The 7 trainees who had confronted her eventually approached her individually to apologize, leading to productive conversations about teamwork, assumptions, and respect. The dining hall confrontation became legendary within the facility, serving as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that respect should be earned through character rather than demanded through intimidation. Sarah Martinez had inadvertently taught everyone involved a lesson that would influence their military careers for years to come. The incident ultimately strengthened the training program by highlighting the importance of understanding the diverse backgrounds and capabilities of military personnel. It demonstrated that effective teamwork required recognition of individual strengths rather than assumptions based on superficial observations. Sarah's restraint and professionalism during the confrontation became a model for how elite personnel should conduct themselves when working with conventional forces, while the trainees' behavior served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting pride and frustration override good judgment and military discipline.